What's up, everyone? It's Dan Field coming at you with my first real, planned, and executed attempt at capturing the Milky Way. I'm gonna explain how I captured it, what gear I used, and a little on the editing process, but first, let's just roll that milkiness. This took some persistence, and I'm really proud of it, I'm not gonna lie. I had originally planned to go really big and spend a few nights capturing the Milky Way in Acadia National Park. 47,000 acres of gorgeous woodlands, granite peaks, and rocky shores. It's one of the few dark areas in the Northeast with the potential to capture anything like this. And it's 8 or 9 hours away. But hey, I'm trying to go big here. The hotel was booked, plans were made, shots were spoken of, and then BAM! Coronavirus. And it had just started getting serious here, so I had to cancel the whole trip. As things progressed over the coming weeks, I researched worthy alternate locations to try to make something happen with the Milky Way, but I was afraid I just wouldn't see very much except for the normal stars due to the light pollution around New England cities. I decided on an area on the shoreline in Rhode Island, not very far from where I grew up. I had everything planned out ahead of time, using a whole series of tools. I knew I needed a clear night with little or no moon, and I narrowed it down to this 3-day window when the Milky Way became visible after 2 a.m. or so. And when the time came, after checking the weather, one of those 3 nights was forecasted to have perfect conditions. Awesome. Except things had escalated with the pandemic and Rhode Island had set up checkpoints. They were reportedly stopping out-of-state cars in an attempt to stop the rising number of wealthy New Yorkers from coming to their second homes and spreading the virus there. It felt pretty sketchy, but come on. I made this a goal and I was determined to see it through. I arrived at Ninigret Park in Charleston after midnight, knowing I had an hour or so to set up, but it was closed due to COVID. In fact, all of the spots that I scouted out on Google Maps were either closed or seemed really, really sketchy. Kind of like I was creeping down somebody's driveway or private road. Not cool. Now at this point, I'm wishing I had made the drive to scope things out in person beforehand. And I'm starting to freak out a little bit. And after driving around for a little over an hour, I found a semi-secluded location that I had actually been to before, but had completely forgotten about. As soon as I got out of the car and I looked up, I could clearly make out the Milky Way, and I immediately felt a complete head change. I just stood there and stared with my jaw on the ground for about 30 seconds, even though I needed to get my cameras to be shooting at this thing an hour and a half ago. I frantically worked as fast as possible to pick out my composition, set up my gear. The whole experience just felt surreal. And the more my eyes adjusted to the darkness, the more detail in the sky that I noticed. This has been in my backyard my entire life. Eyes on the camera, Danny. I was just in total awe, and the slider and the camera were secured to tripods, my test shots were taken, settings checked, double checked. It's go time! I've never seen that many stars before with my naked eye, and I was simply floored by it. It felt like I was in a dream. The moonrise and the sunrise were so amazing on their own that I ended up sticking around longer than expected to capture some of that too. I was so fired up, I didn't sleep at all. While the cameras were running, I took some time to appreciate the views and recorded lots of ambient audio with the H6. My work is done here. All that's left now is packing up my sandy gear and heading home. Woo! Somebody call 911, cause I think I just murdered the Milky Way. I feel great about what I just captured, especially considering it was my first time. I feel blessed to have witnessed this, and with all the fear and panic around the coronavirus at the time of this recording, it seemed to help reset me. I'm happy I didn't let doubt or worry keep me home. I'm really happy I didn't give up after driving around like a stage 5 creeper for over an hour trying to find a decent spot to set up my shot. This wasn't Arcadia. This was better. It reconnected me with the beach that I had grown up on, but with a whole new perspective now. And in a weird way, it just kind of felt like home at the moment, if that makes any sense. All right, we're back. Let's transfer some footage. I'm pulling in a half a terabyte of content from 2 different cameras. That's crazy. I'm so exhausted, but I can't wait to see a few of these photos before I get some much needed rest. I've been awake for over 36 hours. While I wait for these files to transfer, I'm just gonna go ahead and check out what's going on in the news lately.
You didn't do the models. You're not about the modeling on this, but these numbers are making people nervous. Not nervous enough to not reopen, by the way, which is an important point. What is your perspective on it?
Who tells you what?
Yeah.
As soon as they
Well,
use the word
models
safe,
that
means
change
it's
numbers
dangerous.
like this, Chris,
We know
often
it's safe for you.
confuse
You're too
people.
dumb to
But the
understand
fundamental
disease
core
itself.
principle
We know
behind
it's
it
safe.
doesn't
And so
change. And
everybody
that's something
uses
that we've been
this
saying
model
all
for different
along.
things. We got
When you have a
people
lot
trying
of
to
virus
understand all the
activity,
criminals.
and you know that you're able to contain it to a certain degree by the mitigation, the physical separations, the kinds of things that we've been talking about, gateway, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and you start to leapfrog over some of these, you're inviting rebound. And rebound is going to give you spikes, and spikes are going to give you the kinds of numbers. I don't know if those numbers, because I have skepticism about models, about them only as good as the assumptions you put into them, but they're not completely misleading.
what I'm
They're
saying
telling you
is,
something
let's
that's
just
in
talk
reality.
about it.
But when you have
Because
information
if you
that's
stomp on our freedom,
Essentially,
that has one enemy, and it's violence.
Oh my God, wow, I just had the strangest dream. I think that's enough news for today. All kidding aside, I slept for about 14 hours after pulling that all-nighter. The original plan in Acadia was to set up with plenty of time to spare and have a tent or a camper to sleep in. That wasn't really an option. And I guess desperate times call for desperate measures. So let's talk about what goes into a project like this. My first step is figuring out what to shoot, where to shoot it, and when. Another gentle reminder, by the way, that this was my first attempt at this, and in the process of learning how to do it, I learned that the rabbit hole goes pretty deep. And this is just a 10,000 foot view. There's a crap ton of extremely talented people on YouTube that have created really specific deep dives into each individual piece, so I'll include some links if you're into that kind of shenanigans. But I start with an idea, and then try to figure out the best time and place to capture it. So for example, I like to shoot my landscapes during sunrise and sunset and twilight times. I also check an astrological events calendar online. This one is called inthesky.org. It shows asteroid showers, full moons, eclipses, and a ton of really cool stuff. Then I like to familiarize myself with location options beforehand. And one of the easiest ways to do it is by using Google Earth. You can save each location to navigate to when you're ready, and even leave yourself some notes. Next, you're gonna wanna check the weather as things get closer. Clear skies are ideal for astrophotography, although clouds can make things a little bit more moody. During sunrises and sunsets, I actually prefer to have clouds, but definitely not overcast. Forget it, I'm not even gonna go out. I just want enough scattered cloud coverage to allow all that warm light to shine through in really interesting ways. There's really no way to tell. It's all a gamble. You just need to be prepared at the right place at the right time, and every once in a while you get lucky. Once the time, date, and location are figured out, you're gonna wanna scout out some ideas for framing your shot. Google Earth can give you an idea if it's unreasonable to make the trip ahead of time, but if you can be on location with time to spare, you wanna use a tool like Stellarium. When setting up your composition, you can easily tell where your camera will need to be pointed in order to have your subject centered in the frame at the ideal time. Even if you can't actually be on location in advance, you can still get a really good idea of how the scene will look at any specific date, time, location. I recently moved over to a similar app called PhotoPills, which combines sun and moon prediction with location shoot planning and instant calculators for exposure, depth of field, and all sorts of invaluable stuff. This is a paid app, totally worth it for those wanting to kick it up a notch. I really can't say enough good things about the app. It's been a game changer for me. It's actually replaced my entire Google Drive folder of information I had saved, all kinds of graphs and charts and links to obscure calculators, all sorts of geek stuff that I have. But now it's here and it's all incredibly easy. They're not even paying me to say that. I'm gonna get a little dark on you here. Not like that creepy dream sequence kind of dark. I'm talking about dark sites. And when your goal is the Milky Way, you need to find the darkest location possible. That's not always easy depending on where you live. So check out darksitefinder.com. It's a website with a global map of light pollution levels. It's the only source for this kind of information that I know of. And although the data is from 2006 and light pollution levels have definitely increased since then, it's still an amazing tool for scouting your location. For many people, getting to 100% dark sky is not possible without spending an entire day driving. It helps a lot, but when it's not practical, look for an area where the sky is dark in the direction that you want to observe. For example, if you want to see the core of the Milky Way galaxy, look for a location that is dark to the south, with no major cities in that direction. Acadia National Park is ideal because the Milky Way is seen over the Atlantic Ocean, with almost no light pollution. My next best option was getting past all the light of the cities and shooting from the shoreline in Rhode Island. I had some light blooms from Black Island and Long Island Sound in New York, but I was pleasantly surprised how much I could actually see. Okay, we've created the plan. Let's talk about your camera and your camera settings. Gear. My gear is in the description if you're curious, but you really don't need a lot to get started. Chances are the phone that you're watching this on can take a pretty mean picture, especially if you're stabilizing it somehow and using the Pro mode setting. There is a metaphorical cornucopia of higher-end DSLR cameras, lenses, filters, trackers, and full-on telescope rigs specifically designed for astrophotography. But generally speaking, you want to shoot with the widest and fastest lens available, which allows you to get the most light on your camera sensor. It's best to use a lens that's f2.8 or faster, but if you only have a kit lens, f3.5 or whatever the fastest setting you have will have to work. Keep the shot as wide as possible, again to let in more light, but especially because the Milky Way is just so monstrous. The next step is dopert, which doesn't actually make sense. And either just trying to capture the Milky Way without a tripod. Really, it's not even an option. Get one. At the very least, stabilize your phone or your camera as much as possible. I use sandbags on my slider and on my tripods to keep things steady, and will find some extra weight to add if the ground is unstable. My gear bag, I'll drag logs out of the woods, whatever it takes to keep things still. Exposure. Let's talk about exposure. Every camera is different, but you want to find the sweet spot for whatever you're working with. I like to start around ISO 3200, which still looks pretty clean on the A7R IV. I actually shot this around ISO 12800, and that was a bit much. I didn't blow out my highlights or anything, but I know I introduced a lot more noise than I needed to. I feel like I should have been somewhere around ISO 6400, but there's a ton of variables to consider, including the location and the ambient light of the scene, how long your shutter and your interval are, and these are the last minute calls you sometimes need to make before committing to starting a time lapse. I take as many shots as I need to and review it until I feel everything is as balanced and close to perfect in camera to give me an advantage in the post-processing. Shutter. You need to calculate your shutter speed to allow the most amount of light in the camera possible without the natural spin of the planet distorting the stars and creating unwanted star trails. To get nice round stars, use the 500 rule. Divide 500 by the focal length of the lens you're using. So on the A7R, I'm shooting at 16 millimeters, and it's a full frame camera. 500 divided by 16 is 31.25. so I can shoot with the shutter open for 31 seconds for each image without any noticeable movement. If you don't have a lens that wide, or you're using a speed booster, or your camera sensor has a crop factor, the numbers change a bit. The GH5, which is more of a cinema rig that I'm recording this on, is a great example. Using the 500 rule and shooting with the Sigma Art 1.8, 18-35 with the Metabone speed booster, the math starts getting extra weird. 18 millimeters times the 2.0 crop factor is 36 millimeters times 0.71 of the speed booster effectively puts me at a focal length of 25.56 millimeters, and 500 divided by, gives me 19.56 seconds my shutter can remain open before I get star trails on the setup. Okay, now my brain hurts. With the app photo pills that I mentioned earlier, these kind of calculators and more are all included and extremely intuitive. Intervalometer. We're almost ready to shoot the way of milk. The last thing we need to talk about is the intervalometer setup. This feature is camera dependent and not all DSLRs have them. I have heard that some phones have the feature built in natively, but I know that there's a bunch of apps available that will use your phone's camera and allow you to do interval shooting. Now that we know our maximum shutter time, we can choose the time between each photo or interval. For my time lapse, I ended up using 15-second exposures at ISO 12,800 at f2.8 every 16 seconds. I made a last-minute judgment call to up the exposure a bit and keep the intervals shorter so I had more images, and in turn, more time with my time lapse. With 30-second exposures, I would have ended up with 200 images or so with the time that I realistically had before twilight and sunrise just washed it all out. That would have been around 8 seconds of video, and I felt it was just too short. There's a lot of factors to think about when choosing how to set up your interval shooting, depending on the results you're going for, but this should at least get you pointed in the right direction. You wanna know what really chaps my ass? Getting all my gear set up in some remote location, taking a time lapse of epic proportions, one spoken about for the ages, only to get back to my computer and realize that my stars aren't in focus. In fact, they're straight up blurry. Ugh, I had to learn the hard way more than once to make sure to nail the focus. I customized the buttons on my cameras to zoom into the absolute maximum possible distance on the viewfinder and then make those micro adjustments until the stars are as small as humanly possible. The last part of my workflow with Astro is always rechecking focus, zoomed all the way in. I can't stress that enough. Okay, so now you're ready. You've got the secret sauce to getting killer shots of the night sky. Once I get back, transfer all the files off the SD cards. Now it's time to process these photos using some software. I use Lightroom to import, organize, manage, and find images. For those not familiar already, it's basically photo management and photo editing combined into a single tool. So unlike Photoshop, Lightroom is a non-destructive photo editor, meaning that you don't have to worry about saving changes and you can always revert back to an original. With a traditional time-lapse, I would just adjust one photo and copy and paste those settings onto the remainder. You would export all the images and combine them into video editing software such as Premiere Pro or something similar. To use some easy math, it takes 24 images to create 1 second of footage in a sequence with a frame rate of 24 frames per second. 240 images will make a 10-second video. This is paid software, and there are also other free alternatives that do many of the same functions. I'm not gonna run through my whole Lightroom workflow or anything. I just wanna touch on the software that I found to be extremely helpful. LR Timelapse. This was a great find for me and immediately upped my time-lapse game. Gunther from lrtimelapse.com is an artist from Germany who is a pioneer in the time-lapse community. He created this outstanding piece of software, which to my knowledge is really the only one of its kind. It allows you to change camera settings during the dynamic changes of a time-lapse, such as sunrises or sunsets, and then correct those spikes in post-production. You can change your aperture, shutter speed, and your ISO as your scene gets darker and brighter. Later on, in the software, you keyframe several images in the sequence and then blend all the edits across the images evenly in Lightroom. To do this manually would be next to impossible. LRT has tools for deflicker, motion blur, and a whole slew of other features. You can use all the major features for free too, up to 400 images per sequence, and there's a couple options for paid versions if you end up loving it. I loved it. LRT is awesome, and I purchased the Pro version within a week of using it. Now it's a foundational part of my workflow for all my time lapses. Gunther, Prost. Sequator. Sequator, or Sequator, not really sure how that's pronounced, is a free program meant to stack images of the night sky for the purpose of reducing noise. It also has features that help mask out the foreground. The program has been around since at least 2015, and I just recently found out about it. It's simple to use and will save you from manually doing some serious editing in Photoshop and help speed up the workflow for processing astrophotos. This is only available for PC, and Mac users all seem to use a nearly identical program called Starry Sky Stacker. Photoshop. Okay, the last one is Photoshop, and this gets really crazy. Photoshop has a learning curve, and although I'm fairly competent with the basics, I feel like I only scratched the surface with the possibilities Photoshop has specifically for astrophotography. I spent an embarrassing amount of time separating the red, blue, and green color channels individually and editing them and learning about selecting and masking certain areas and colors to make some pop without affecting others, and how to sharpen just the stars without affecting any other parts of the image. I can't even begin to break this process down here. It's a whole other level that I have yet to fully explore. I've got to give it to Trevor Jones at Astro Backyard. His work, it's out of this world. I'm linking the tutorial because I feel it was the biggest contributing factor in making this image really pop the way I wanted. Check out his work if you're into that kind of super granular and advanced editing. He gets into a lot of deep space astrophotography using telescopes, star trackers, and just a ton of really cool gear that I don't have yet. So that is how I shot and edited the Milky Way, and an overview of my current workflow. I hope I provided some value to you, made you laugh, or at least gave you some delicious Milky Way shots to drink in. For those that may be inspired to try some astrophotography or time lapses of your own, whatever your skill level may be, drop in your own pictures, projects, and experiments in the comments. Let me see what you create. Like this video, subscribe to my channels, smash the notification bell to stay updated when I drop the next one. All that typical blah 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 that YouTubers say to help me feed my insatiable ego. No, seriously, I'm trying to grow this channel, trying to grow in this space. I love connecting and interacting with you guys. Stay safe, stay creative, and I'll catch you in the next one.